Three violent muggers cornered a freezing homeless man and his crying daughter in a Chicago alley, expecting an easy score. They didn't know the shivering man in dirty rags was a decorated, retired Tier 1 Navy SEAL. In exactly 42 seconds, those thieves would be begging for their lives. The wind howling off Lake Michigan didn't just bite, it chewed through layers of cheap denim and thermal cotton, sinking its icy teeth straight into the bone. It was late January in Chicago, a city that offered no mercy to those who fell through the cracks of society. Amos Pendleton sat on a frozen cardboard mat, his broad shoulders hunched forward to form a human shield against the wind. Tucked inside his oversized, frayed military surplus coat was the only thing in the universe that mattered to him, his 7-year-old daughter, Lily. She was asleep, her small face pressed against his chest, her shallow breaths warming his collarbone. Amos pulled his wool beanie lower over his scarred forehead, his pale blue eyes scanning the pedestrian traffic of the Gold Coast district with a practiced, mechanical precision. Nobody looked at them. To the wealthy elite, shuffling between high-end boutiques and idling luxury SUVs, Amos and Lily were invisible. They were an uncomfortable smudge on an otherwise pristine metropolitan canvas. Amos preferred the invisibility, but it came with a cost. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, a dull, hollow ache that he had learned to compartmentalize. Compartmentalization was a skill Amos had mastered over a 12-year career in the United States Navy, 8 of those spent operating in the shadows with DevGru SEAL Team 6. He had survived the suffocating dust storms of Helmand Province, high-stakes maritime boardings in the dead of night, and firefights that would give ordinary men night terrors for a lifetime. But none of that training had prepared him for the American healthcare system. When his wife, Sarah, was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, the VA benefits hadn't covered the experimental treatments she desperately needed. Amos had drained his savings, sold his house, and taken out predatory loans to buy her an extra 8 months of life. When she finally passed away, holding his hand in a sterile hospice room, Amos was left with crippling debt, a grieving toddler, and a broken spirit. The bank took the car. The landlords demanded first and last month's rent he didn't have. Within a year, a man who had hunted high-value targets for the Pentagon was hunting for half-eaten sandwiches in the dumpsters behind bakeries. "Daddy?" Lily murmured, her voice muffled by the heavy coat. She shifted, her small hands clutching the worn fabric of his flannel shirt. "I'm cold." "I know, baby girl," Amos whispered, tightening his arms around her. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, soothing and steady. "We'll get moving soon. The shelters open up their lottery at 5 o'clock. We're going to get a warm bed tonight, I promise." Amos's gaze drifted down the icy sidewalk, locking onto the revolving doors of a towering, glass-fronted corporate building, the Carmichael Enterprise Tower. Suddenly, a flurry of activity erupted at the curb. 2 men in tailored black suits with subtle earpieces stepped out of the building, scanning the perimeter with aggressive vigilance. Amos recognized the posture immediately. Private security, likely ex-law enforcement or military washouts. A moment later, a woman strode out of the revolving doors. She was a striking figure, radiating an aura of absolute authority. Jacqueline Carmichael, the billionaire CEO of Carmichael Industries. She wore a tailored charcoal wool coat over a sharp designer suit, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, flawless twist. She was barking orders into a cell phone, her sharp features set in a mask of intense irritation, completely oblivious to the freezing world around her. As she moved briskly toward a waiting black Lincoln Navigator, the security detail flanking her, a sudden, violent gust of wind whipped down the street. It caught the edges of her unbuttoned coat, and in her hurried motion, a thick, leather-bound planner slipped from the crook of her arm. It hit the salted pavement with a soft thud and slid under the rear tire of an adjacent parked car, completely hidden from the view of her rushing entourage. Jacqueline didn't notice. The security detail didn't notice. The heavy door of the Navigator slammed shut, and the vehicle pulled seamlessly into the evening traffic, leaving behind nothing but exhaust fumes. Amos watched the SUV disappear. He gently nudged Lily. "Stay right here, sweetheart. Don't move." He stood up, his joints popping in the bitter cold, and walked over to the parked car. Kneeling, he reached under the tire and pulled out the planner. It was made of heavy, full-grain Italian leather. As he picked it up, a gold-plated clasp popped open, revealing the contents. It wasn't just a calendar. There were highly classified-looking corporate access cards, handwritten notes with financial figures that made Amos's eyes water, and tucked into a clear plastic sleeve, a photograph of a young boy, Jacqueline's son, smiling brightly. Amos snapped it shut. This was dangerous material. More importantly, returning it might yield a reward. Enough for a motel room for a week, enough for a hot meal that didn't come from a charity kitchen. He slipped the heavy planner into his coat pocket and hurried back to Lily, scooping her up into his arms. "Come on, Bug. We're going for a walk." What Amos didn't know was that he wasn't the only one who had seen the billionaire drop her planner. From the shadowy alcove of a nearby alley, 3 pairs of eyes had been watching the entire exchange. And they weren't interested in returning it for a reward. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging Chicago into an oppressive, freezing darkness. The city lights flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows across the snowbanked streets. Amos carried Lily toward Lower Wacker Drive, a subterranean labyrinth of service roads and loading docks that served as a refuge for the city's invisible population. It was dangerous down there, but it blocked the lethal wind. Lily's coughing had worsened, a dry, rattling sound that tore at Amos's heart. He needed to find a secure corner, bundle her up, and then figure out how to contact Carmichael Industries without getting arrested for theft. He found a recessed alcove near an old, defunct steam vent that radiated a faint, meager warmth. He set his backpack down, pulled out a heavily patched sleeping bag, and began creating a makeshift nest for his daughter. "Get in, Lily. Keep your boots on," Amos instructed, his tone gentle but firm. As she crawled into the sleeping bag, Amos's finely tuned instincts flared. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. The subtle, echoing acoustics of the underground tunnel shifted. The sound of a dripping pipe was suddenly masked by the faint crunch of heavy boots on loose gravel. Amos didn't turn his head immediately. He kept his eyes on Lily, his hands calmly adjusting the zipper of her sleeping bag. But his mind instantly shifted gears, dropping into a cold, hyper-analytical state. 3 distinct footfalls, coming from the blind side. Heavy breathing, smell of cheap liquor and unwashed clothes, aggressive pacing. Well, well, well. "Look what we got here," a voice sneered, echoing off the damp concrete walls. Amos slowly stood up, turning to face the intruders. There were 3 of them, street predators who preyed on the weak. The leader was a tall, wiry man named Derek, sporting a teardrop tattoo under his left eye and a greasy winter coat. To his right stood Roach, a heavy-set brute carrying a rusted metal pipe. On the left was Tommy, younger, twitchy, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "You lost, old man?" Derek asked, taking a step forward, blocking the only exit from the alcove. "This is our spot. You gotta pay rent." Amos kept his hands open and raised to chest height, a non-threatening posture that, to a trained operator, was perfectly positioned to strike or defend. "We don't want any trouble," Amos said, his voice completely devoid of fear, flat and steady. "My daughter is sick. We're just staying out of the wind. We'll be gone by morning." Derek laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He glanced at the sleeping bag, his eyes lingering on Lily for a second too long. Amos's jaw tightened. "I saw you up on Michigan Avenue, homeless," Derek said, his eyes snapping back to Amos. "I saw what you picked up. That rich bitch dropped her little leather book. I know it's got credit cards in it. Maybe cash. Hand it over, and maybe we let you and the brat walk out of here with all your teeth." "I don't have what you're looking for," Amos lied smoothly. "It was just a piece of trash." Shing. Derek flicked his wrist, and a 4-inch switchblade sprang open, the cheap metal catching the dim amber light of the tunnel. "Don't play me for a fool, bum," Derek spat, closing the distance. He was now just 6 feet away. "Give me the book, give me your bag, and give me whatever change you got in those pockets." Amos's peripheral vision tracked Roach, shifting the metal pipe in his grip. Tommy pulled his hands out of his pockets, revealing a heavy set of brass knuckles. "Listen to me very carefully," Amos said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on a chilling, authoritative resonance. "Turn around and walk away. If you take one more step toward my daughter, I am going to hurt you." All of you." For a split second, Tommy hesitated, unnerved by the absolute lack of panic in the homeless man's eyes. But Derek was blinded by ego and greed. "Tough guy," Derek sneered. He lunged forward, thrusting the switchblade toward Amos's stomach. It was a fatal miscalculation. Amos didn't step back. He stepped inside the arc of the blade. Time seemed to dilate for the retired SEAL. The OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act, processed in a fraction of a millisecond. Amos's left hand shot out, catching Derek's wrist with a grip like a steel vise. He twisted sharply, applying immense torque to the joint. A loud snap echoed in the tunnel, followed instantly by a blood-curdling scream as Derek's radius bone fractured. The knife clattered to the concrete. Before Derek could even process the pain of his broken arm, Amos drove the heel of his right palm upward, striking Derek squarely under the chin. The impact snapped Derek's head back, scrambling his equilibrium and dropping him to the ground in an unconscious heap. Total elapsed time: 2 seconds. Roach roared in anger and swung the heavy metal pipe at Amos's head. Amos ducked seamlessly beneath the wild, uncoordinated swing. He pivoted on his back foot, driving a devastating knee into Roach's floating ribs. The sickening crunch of breaking cartilage filled the air. As Roach doubled over, gasping for breath, Amos delivered a precise, brutal elbow strike to the back of the man's neck, driving his face directly into the concrete floor. Roach went limp, spitting blood and teeth. Tommy stood frozen, his eyes wide with absolute horror. The brass knuckles suddenly felt very heavy and entirely useless. The frail, shivering homeless man had just dismantled his 2 heavily armed friends in less than 5 seconds, with surgical, terrifying violence. Amos slowly turned his head to look at Tommy. The pale blue eyes were no longer those of a weary father. They were the cold, dead eyes of a Tier 1 operator who had eliminated threats in the most dangerous corners of the globe. "Run," Amos whispered. Tommy didn't hesitate. He spun around, slipped on a patch of ice, scrambled to his feet in a panic, and bolted down the tunnel, disappearing into the darkness. Amos stood perfectly still for a moment, his breathing barely elevated. He looked down at the 2 groaning men at his feet. He reached down, picked up Derek's switchblade, closed it, and tossed it into the darkness. "Daddy?" Amos's heart slammed against his ribs the first time it had raced all evening. He turned. Lily was sitting up in the sleeping bag, her eyes wide, staring at the bodies on the ground. Amos rushed over to her, his lethal demeanor instantly vanishing, replaced by frantic paternal warmth. He knelt beside her, checking her face. "It's okay, Lily. It's over. They were trying to take our things, and I had to stop them," Amos said, his hands trembling slightly as he touched her cold cheek. "Are they dead?" she asked in a small voice. "No, sweetheart. Just resting," Amos said, quickly packing up the sleeping bag and shoving it into his backpack. "But we have to go. Now." He couldn't stay here. The police would eventually come. If they ran his fingerprints, his identity would be flagged. Given his current living situation, Child Protective Services would be called immediately. They would take Lily away from him. It was his deepest, most paralyzing fear. Amos hoisted his backpack, scooped Lily into his arms, and disappeared into the labyrinth of Lower Wacker Drive, leaving the bleeding muggers behind. 50 stories above the frozen streets, Jacqueline Carmichael stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse office, staring out at the glittering skyline. She held a glass of expensive bourbon, her reflection in the glass betraying the deep exhaustion she carefully hid from her board of directors. The door behind her opened softly. David Reed, her head of corporate security, stepped into the dimly lit office. Reed was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, a former FBI hostage rescue team commander who rarely smiled and never brought good news after 9 p.m. "Miss Carmichael," Reed said, his voice clipped and professional. "We have a situation." Jacqueline turned, taking a slow sip of her bourbon. "I pay you a very generous salary to ensure I never have situations, David. What is it?" "Your master planner is missing," Reed stated. Jacqueline's eyes narrowed, her hand instinctively patting the empty pocket of her blazer. A cold spike of adrenaline hit her. That planner contained the access codes to the company's offline servers, draft blueprints for a multi-billion-dollar government defense contract, and worse, the only physical photograph she had of her son, Leo, from before the accident. "I had it when I left the building," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "You dropped it," Reed said, stepping forward and handing her a tablet. On the screen was high-resolution security footage from the street camera outside the tower. It showed the gust of wind, the planner falling, and the SUV driving away. Then, the footage zoomed in. It showed a tall, heavily bearded homeless man in a ragged coat walking over, picking up the planner, looking inside, and walking away with a small child in his arms. "A vagrant has it," Jacqueline scoffed, running a hand through her perfectly styled hair. "Have the police sweep the perimeter. Offer a cash reward. He's probably traded it for a bottle of vodka by now." "I don't think so, ma'am," Reed said, tapping the tablet to change the screen. "You opted for the level 4 security package on all your personal items last year. The planner has a micro GPS transmitter woven into the leather spine. It's active." Jacqueline looked up, a glimmer of relief in her eyes. "You have its location?" "Yes. But that's not the concerning part," Reed said, his expression grave. He swiped the tablet again, showing a live feed from a police body camera. "About 20 minutes ago, we tracked the signal to an underground tunnel system on Lower Wacker. By the time my advance team arrived, they found this." Jacqueline looked at the screen. It showed paramedics loading 2 severely battered men into an ambulance. The concrete floor of the tunnel was stained with blood. "Did the homeless man get attacked?" Jacqueline asked. "No," Reed said quietly. "My men spoke to the responding officers. The 2 men in the ambulance are known gang enforcers, Derek Vance and a guy they call Roach. They're heavy hitters. Both of them are currently in the ICU. Vance has a compound fracture of the radius, a shattered mandible, and severe concussion. Roach has 3 broken ribs and a crushed trachea." Jacqueline frowned, confused. "So, a gang dispute?" "Ma'am, the damage done to these men wasn't a street brawl," Reed explained, leaning forward. The veteran law enforcement officer in him completely captivated. The strikes were hyper-precise. Minimum effort, maximum anatomical destruction. The bones were broken at exact fulcrum points. Whoever did this is a highly trained combat specialist, and the GPS signal for your planner is moving away from the scene. Jacqueline stared at the paused footage of the homeless man picking up her book, the way he moved, the way he scanned the street before stepping off the curb. It wasn't the erratic shuffle of an addict. It was deliberate. "Where is the signal now?" Jacqueline asked, setting her glass down. "It's stationary. An abandoned subway maintenance room near the Red Line station," Reed replied. "I have a tactical team assembling. We'll go in, secure the asset, and neutralize the threat." "No," Jacqueline said sharply. Reed blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" "You said he has a child with him," Jacqueline said, staring at the grainy image of the little girl huddled in the man's coat. "I am not having a corporate tactical squad raid a room and start shooting with a child in the crossfire. Have my car brought around. I'm going with you." "Miss Carmichael, I strongly advise against—" "I didn't ask for your advice, David," Jacqueline snapped, grabbing her coat. "If this man is what you say he is, sending in heavily armed men with flashbangs is going to get someone killed. I want my property back, and I want to look this man in the eye." 20 minutes later, a sleek black SUV pulled to a silent stop in a deserted alleyway behind the Red Line subway entrance. The snow was falling heavily now, blanketing the city in an eerie, muffled silence. Reed, wearing a Kevlar vest beneath his coat, stepped out and motioned for 2 of his operatives to flank the rusty steel door leading down into the maintenance tunnels. Jacqueline stepped out of the vehicle, the bitter cold instantly slicing through her designer wool. "The signal is 50 yards down this corridor, behind a reinforced utility door," Reed whispered, holding a biometric tracker. "Stay behind me, Miss Carmichael. Please." They descended the concrete stairs, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The air smelled of rust, ozone, and damp earth. They reached a heavy steel door, slightly ajar, a faint, flickering orange light spilling from the crack. Reed unholstered his weapon, keeping it pointed at the floor, and slowly pushed the door open. Inside the cavernous concrete room, Amos had built a small fire in a rusted metal barrel. Lily was asleep on a pile